Selena Gomez, Kanye West, Chappell Roan, Demi Lovato. What do these people have in common, besides their fame and musical success? These celebrities have all been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Welcome to Rewriting Bipolar, a podcast where we will be exploring the diagnosis, its clinical meaning, history, and how the term impacts the lives of individuals who are diagnosed. The importance of discussing the bipolar diagnosis goes far beyond a handful of famous individuals. According to the World Health Organization, 1 in 200 people are currently living with bipolar disorder. This equates to roughly 37 million people who are dealing with their own internal mood instability alongside a diagnosis that is constantly being redefined. I'm your host, Sophia Olson, and in this series, we will be covering the clinical criteria and historical evolution of bipolar disorder, how a diagnosis impacts people's personal identities, the importance of narrative therapeutic approaches, and finally, we will get to hear the voices and perspectives of individuals who have received a bipolar diagnosis. In the first part of this episode, we are diving into the basics of the diagnosis. What is bipolar disorder in both a clinical context and a historical one? And how does hysteria factor into all of this? After we have established this background information, we will explore the ideas of narrative identity and therapy. We will discuss how a bipolar diagnosis and the experience of mood instability impacts personal identity and how storytelling factors into this complex picture. Modern psychiatry is dominated by the hyperspecific verbiage and laundry list of symptoms that is found in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or more simply, the DSM. The DSM outlines the specific criteria for each psychiatric disorder, its list of symptoms, and the duration a person must experience these symptoms in order to receive a diagnosis. On paper, the DSM can make it seem like any psychiatric condition is straightforward and clear-cut. But the realities that individuals face are far more nuanced than a list of symptomatic boxes a psychiatrist can check. Many people have a basic understanding that bipolar disorder involves highs and lows, where people's moods shift from states of mania and depression. So before we discuss the history of the bipolar diagnosis, let's briefly dive into the specifics of modern psychiatric language. The 5th edition of the DSM, published in 2013, explains that bipolar disorder is broken up into 2 major subgroups, bipolar type 1 and bipolar type 2. Bipolar type 1 is often considered the more severe of the two and is characterized by the presence of a manic episode. But what exactly is a manic episode? The DSM states that a manic episode is a period of at least 1 week when a person has extremely high-spirited or irritable energy and experiences at least 3 of the following symptoms: decreased need for sleep, increased or faster speech, racing thoughts, distractibility, increased activity or working on many projects at once, and increased risky or impulsive behavior, like reckless driving, spending, or promiscuity. These symptoms can be so disruptive to a person's life that they end up requiring intensive psychiatric care or hospitalization. Bipolar type 2 is defined by hypomania, which is essentially a lower level, less severe form of mania that only needs to persist for 4 days in order to receive a diagnosis. Another defining characteristic of bipolar type 2 is the presence of a major depressive episode. A depressive episode is characterized by a period of at least 2 weeks where the person experiences intense sadness, despair, and loss of interest in once enjoyable activities, and at least 4 of the following symptoms: feelings of worthlessness or guilt, fatigue, changes in sleep and appetite, restlessness or slowed speech, difficulty concentrating, or thoughts of death and suicide. People with bipolar type 1 often also experience depressive episodes, but it is not a diagnostic requirement. In addition to type 1 and 2, there is also cyclothymia, which is thought of as a milder form of bipolar disorder in which a person's mood swings from hypomanic and depressive symptoms more frequently, but the intensity of the moods is not as severe as in type 1 or 2. The rigorous criteria set forth in the pages of the DSM simulate a feeling of certainty, and the manual creates a streamlined system of box checking that allows clinicians to diagnose individuals with ease. Surely, these diagnostic categories have persisted consistently over the decades, right? But the truth of the matter is that diagnostic goalposts shift with each edition of the DSM. Diagnoses are constantly being reinvented or rewritten altogether. So, where does bipolar disorder fit into the broader psychiatric story and history? The term bipolar did not enter clinical vocabulary until the 1980 publication of the third edition of the DSM. Prior to the DSM-3, the condition was known as manic depressive disorder. But where did those terms come from? The term mania dates back all the way to ancient Greece and was used to describe frenzy, extreme passion, fury, or madness. Melancholia, the root for our modern word of melancholy, described intense sadness or dejection. But our conceptions of diagnostic terms have undoubtedly changed over the centuries. The rise of asylums in 18th century France prompted more careful examination of individuals experiencing mental distress. And soon, clinicians began to see that manic and melancholic temperaments were not always completely separate things, but that some individuals actually oscillated between these two extremes in some kind of predictable pattern. These 18th century clinicians introduced terms like monomania, describing a partial delirium, and folie circulaire, meaning circular madness. These diagnostic terms described patient profiles that would now be labeled as bipolar. So even though the cluster of symptoms we now call bipolar disorder have been documented for centuries, the language we use to describe the condition has changed. Early psychiatrists continued to debate the symptomatic bounds and specific criteria of this manic depressive temperament, but their clinical conversations did not change the experiences of those dealing with mental distress. It's also worth mentioning that the DSM and the psychiatric discipline have been heavily critiqued for decades. Figures in the anti-psychiatry movement of the 1960s often rejected the idea of mental illness altogether. What's important to understand is that psychiatric diagnoses should not be viewed as objective, factual labels. They are terms that attempt to describe something nearly indescribable, the intricacies and idiosyncrasies of the human brain and behavior. To bring the story of bipolar disorder into the 20th century, we must turn to German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin. To bring the story of bipolar disorder into the 20th century, we must turn to German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin. In 1918, he published the Statistical Manual for the Use of Institutions for the Insane. That's definitely a mouthful, but we can think of this as the precursor for the DSM. It was a taxonomy of mood disorders that paved the way for the DSM and resulted in the formal diagnosis of manic depressive insanity. Kraepelin had picked a name that worked. He successfully branded the mood disorder for the next 50 years. The second edition of the DSM, published in 1968, officially named the condition as manic depressive illness. Maybe they thought that sounded a little bit nicer than insanity. And now we can finally circle back to the 1980 publication of the DSM-3, where clinicians abandoned the title of manic depression and now embraced the bipolar label. But the DSM-3 is fascinating for another reason too. This edition is also when the diagnosis of hysteria was written out of the official diagnostic language. This is an incredibly important moment within the realm of psychiatric vocabulary. As modern listeners, it seems maybe ridiculous to consider that someone would genuinely be clinically diagnosed as hysteric. But 1980 was not that long ago. To put this in perspective, people were still being diagnosed with hysteria in the same era when the Star Wars movies were being released and cell phones and emails were invented. In contemporary culture, we use the term as an adjective to describe someone acting with intense emotion or exaggeration. Importantly, hysterical is a term that we still largely reserve for women. She's hysterical means that she's irrational, she shouldn't be trusted, she's even a bit crazy. This is not a mistake. The history of hysteria, similarly to mania, dates back to antiquity. The word hysteria is derived from the ancient Greek word for uterus and first appears in the writings of Hippocrates around the 5th century BC. It was believed that abnormal movements or positions of the uterus were responsible for various ailments, ranging from anxiety to seizures, that afflicted women. But in ancient Greece, hysteria was not a disease itself. It was rather a term used to describe the state of a woman's uterus. As the centuries progressed, however, clinicians, all men, referred back to the ancient origins of hysteria as a way to validate and legitimize the diagnosis. By the 17th century, doctors began to describe hysteria as an affliction of the mind, a condition that was known to cause unstable moods and mental temperaments. In modern vernacular, this kind of mercurial temperament may be described as bipolar disorder. Hysteria really gained traction during the 18th and early 19th centuries, and it's important to understand that the diagnosis still did not have one fixed meaning. It was an extremely nebulous term that essentially became a catch-all for any issue a woman was having that men did not understand. One of the primary treatments for hysteria was the rest cure. The rest cure instructed women to abstain from any intellectual activity or social interaction, and to instead immerse themselves in a life of domesticity. Basically, if you were a woman acting outside the narrow confines of gender roles, you could be written off as hysteric. The misogynistic nature of hysteria was further compounded by the work of none other than Sigmund Freud. He described the disorder as characteristically feminine and used the diagnosis to support the idea that women were inherently more fragile and emotionally unstable than men. And once again, it is vitally important to understand that the hysteria diagnosis rarely ever had an agreed-upon definition. Everything from convulsions to defiance to sadness to anger could be explained by hysteria. The diagnosis was a way to pathologize femininity and attempted to provide a medicalized basis for women being intellectually, physically, and morally inferior to men. Even though hysteria was written into the DSM for decades, it does not mean that the term was ever objective. You might think that this discussion of hysteria is a random rabbit hole. But what is important to understand is that mental health diagnoses are socially constructed, meaning that these terms change and evolve because they are informed by whatever social contexts are happening at that time. Diagnostic verbiage does not exist within a vacuum. The history of hysteria clearly shows the complicated and often problematic history of psychiatry and mental health diagnoses. The terms we use to describe mental distress are always changing and are often stigmatizing. The blurry lines of psychiatric diagnoses are further illuminated when considering that some women who were diagnosed with hysteria under the DSM-2 were later diagnosed with cyclothymia upon the publication of the DSM-3. A new day meant a new diagnosis, but the symptoms the patient faced had not changed. Diagnostic discrimination, of course, did not end when hysteria was removed from the DSM. Unjust treatment still persists, especially for people of color. A small example of this is that Black individuals are much more likely to get misdiagnosed with schizophrenia as opposed to a bipolar diagnosis. When analyzing modern psychiatric diagnostic labels, we must be careful to not treat these terms as objective truths. Mental health diagnoses form historical narratives and are constantly evolving. They are not set in stone, but they are without a doubt hugely impactful. And this is not to say that the entire practice of psychiatric diagnosis should be thrown away. Receiving a specific diagnosis can validate the experience of an individual suffering and help clinicians provide better treatment. Simultaneously, these labels can be confining and oversimplify a person's experience. Each person diagnosed with bipolar is far more complex than a neat set of symptoms. No person's story can be neatly summarized by the criteria set forth by the DSM. Yet diagnostic labels often become a big part of people's lives. So, how does a bipolar diagnosis impact one's individual identity? And how are life stories impacted by a diagnostic label? Before we dive into part 2 of this introductory episode, I want to ask, who are you? What stories do you tell about yourself? How do you make sense of the multitude of experiences you have endured throughout your life? The stories you tell about yourself not only determine how you show up in your daily life, but they also inform your internal sense of self, your narrative identity. The idea of narrative identity stems from the work of psychologist Dan McAdams and refers to an individual's internalized, evolving, and integrative story of self. We make sense of ourselves through stories, and when an individual can interpret their own life as a coherent story, it acts as a psychological resource that provides one with a solid sense of self and personal meaning. But forming a consistent and stable narrative identity is not always a straightforward process, especially for those with a mental health diagnosis. The negative stigma around mental illness can make it much harder to establish a positive narrative identity. In recent years, we have made major strides when it comes to accepting and destigmatizing mental illness. But societal messages that say that people with mental health diagnoses are fundamentally flawed still persist. In addition to the cultural stigma, the very experience of mental distress can negatively impact one's sense of self, because people may struggle to formulate a positive personal narrative alongside their negative symptoms. In the case of bipolar disorder, a condition marked by major shifts in people's moods, formulating a stable sense of self is particularly hard. Kay Redfield Jamison discusses this struggle in her book, An Unquiet Mind, a memoir of moods and madness. Jamison is a renowned professor of psychiatry, and her book explores her experience with bipolar disorder. She writes, "Which of my feelings are real? Which of the me's is me? The wild, impulsive, chaotic, energetic, and crazy one? Or the shy, withdrawn, desperate, suicidal, doomed, and tired one? Probably a bit of both." This quote perfectly encapsulates how individuals who experience extreme highs and lows may struggle to incorporate their vastly different experiences of self into a coherent, personal narrative. Qualitative studies, a form of psychological research that focuses on understanding human behavior and emotions through the study of personal experiences, have found that the radical shifts in mood that come with bipolar can make people diagnosed with the condition feel like they are unable to control their lives or make sense of their experiences. Through the lens of narrative identity, this translates into people having low themes of agency and communion. Agency refers to independence, and communion to social connection and support. Essentially, the symptoms of bipolar disorder alongside societal stigma can leave individuals feeling disempowered. But it is important to remember that stories are not set in stone. Personal narratives can be reframed and reauthored. Another facet of narrative identity is the idea of redemption, or the ability for someone to shift their perception of an experience from bad to good. A study asked a group of women with bipolar disorder to think about their life story, past, present, and future, as a series of chapters. This research found that even though their past chapters had lower agency and communion, they had higher themes of redemption when compared to the control group without bipolar. So, by taking inventory of their past chapters, the good, the bad, and the ugly, the women with bipolar were able to derive a stronger sense of hope and empowerment. Even though the experience of bipolar disorder can result in many challenges and negative experiences, this distress does not have to be the defining aspect of an individual's story. Changes in a person's narrative identity depend on the meaning they derive from their experiences. Memoirs like Jameson's provide us with a great example of how taking inventory of one's traumatic and chaotic past can help one formulate a resilient and empowered sense of self. By becoming the author of her own story, she reclaims agency over her experiences. As we discussed, the bipolar label is often boiled down to a reductive set of symptoms outlined by the DSM. But Jameson's work complexifies the meaning of the diagnosis and provides a valuable resource for understanding the condition. So, how can these ideas of agency, authorship, and empowerment be used for genuine therapeutic treatment? While there are many types of therapy, the practice of narrative therapy can be especially useful for helping individuals craft strong and resilient identities. But what is narrative therapy? This therapeutic framework grounds itself in the idea that there is no singular truth about someone's experience, and that individuals can derive their own empowered meanings from their life events. The practice centers the patient's strengths as a way to help them craft an identity that rejects stigma and create new stories of resilience. A core tenet of narrative therapy is externalization, the idea that the patient is not the problem, but is rather dealing with problems. This simple shift in thinking is powerful in the face of societal messages that tell people that there is something inherently wrong with them if they have a mental health diagnosis. Within the realm of narrative therapy, the therapist takes on the role of co-author and specifically seeks to center the agency of the individual. By honoring and uplifting the patient's status as an expert by experience, there is more room to resist the stigmatizing or self-defeating narratives that can accompany mental illness. The societal stigma that surrounds bipolar and the individual disempowerment that people can experience from the disorder requires a nuanced therapeutic approach. For individuals with bipolar, narrative therapy may be particularly helpful, as it creates a space to deliberately rewrite negative narratives of self and focus on forming an empowered identity. Another aspect of narrative therapy is the idea of sparkling moments, a term that refers to the strengths, positive traits, and good experiences that people have. The idea of focusing on the beneficial experiences people with bipolar disorder have is especially important given the struggles that come with the stigma of the bipolar label and the disorienting moods that people experience. The bipolar label can often speak for an individual, meaning that the nuanced experiences people have are often overlooked or ignored, and that the individual is seen as a patient first rather than a person. A mental health diagnosis can often undermine a person's credibility and create the idea that they should not be listened to or believed. This is why a narrative approach that centers an individual's agency and validates their voice is so important. No therapeutic discipline is perfect, but narrative therapy offers individuals a framework where they can forge an empowered identity and a way for them to reclaim their story in the face of both societal stigma and personal distress. Although narrative therapy is more complex than independent personal narration in the form of journaling or memoir, the framework also highlights how powerful that kind of personal storytelling can be. The psychiatric discipline and its reliance on the DSM often results in clinicians ignoring the complex individual experiences people have. Lived experience is too often considered an afterthought and not validated as a genuine source of knowledge. But there is a huge amount of wisdom that can be gained when individuals are given the space to tell their own stories. Today we covered a lot. We started the episode by talking about the modern meaning and history of bipolar disorder, and then discussed hysteria and how psychiatric diagnoses are social constructions, not objective truths. In addition to this fascinating history, we talked about how constructing a cohesive, coherent story of self can be a struggle, especially for individuals who deal with the mood fluctuations that come along with bipolar. But through self-authorship and a therapeutic focus on narrative, people can craft empowered identities. As Kay Redfield Jamison said, she is not narrowly defined by her ups or her downs. She is instead a bit of both. In the next episode, we will be hearing the voices of people who have dealt with a bipolar diagnosis. The interviews I conducted provide us with rich insight into the bipolar experience, and we will gain an understanding for the condition in a way that is much more nuanced than a simple list of symptoms. By listening to the complex and unique stories of these individuals, we will gain a much deeper understanding of what the bipolar diagnostic label means and how the term factors into people's lives. Thank you so much for listening to the first episode of Rewriting Bipolar. I'm your host, Sophia Olson, and remember to take care of and be kind to yourself. If you are experiencing a mental health crisis, dial 988 for help. And if you are looking for help related to depression and bipolar disorder, visit the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance website at dbsalliance.org for more resources.